Billionaire overhears nurse comforting his sick son at night and falls madly in love. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. How was the surprise? Mr. Peter is not 100% well yet, but he's on his way to a full recovery. In the meantime, I'm here to serve you in his absence. But tell me, my family, do you have any issues with me? Have I satisfied you? If you want me to stay, I will. And if you want me to leave, I will respect your wishes. Before we begin, let's take a moment for a beautiful Friday prayer for my precious family. May your hearts be filled with peace, your souls with love, and your lives with endless joy. May all your worries be lifted, and may you always walk in the light of love and happiness. Now tell me, how was the last story served by Mr. Peter? Did it touch your hearts the way he always does? Let's not waste another moment. Let's start with love. Chapter 1. Silent shores. The salt-tinged breeze caught Zaria's braids as she stood at the wrought-iron gates of Montclair estate. She inhaled deeply, drawing courage from the crisp ocean air that reminded her of childhood summers spent by the sea with her grandmother. Now that same grandmother had recovered from her illness, and Zaria needed to find her place in this small coastal town where time seemed to move to the rhythm of the waves. "It's just a job," she whispered to herself, adjusting the collar of her navy blazer. But the imposing stone mansion perched on the cliff's edge, with its Gothic turrets and endless windows staring like vacant eyes toward the horizon, suggested otherwise. This place held stories and secrets. The intercom crackled as Zaria pressed the button. "Montclair residence." The voice was female, elderly, and clipped. "Zaria Kalua. I have an appointment with Mr. Montclair regarding the caregiver position." A pause, then a mechanical buzz as the gates slowly parted. Zaria squared her shoulders and began the long walk up the cobblestone driveway, her sensible heels clicking a steady rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The wide double doors swung open before she could knock, revealing a stern-faced housekeeper with silver hair pulled into a tight bun. "Mrs. Fletcher," the woman introduced herself without a smile. "Mr. Montclair is in his study. Follow me." The entrance hall soared 3 stories high, dominated by a crystal chandelier that cast rainbow prisms across marble floors. Despite the grandeur, Zaria immediately sensed something missing: laughter, warmth, life. The mansion felt like a museum dedicated to grief. "He doesn't like to be kept waiting," Mrs. Fletcher said over her shoulder as they navigated a long hallway adorned with maritime paintings and model ships enclosed in glass cases. They stopped before a heavy oak door. Mrs. Fletcher knocked twice. "Enter." The voice from within was deep, authoritative, and utterly devoid of emotion. The housekeeper opened the door and announced, "Miss Kalua, sir," before disappearing like a ghost, leaving Zaria standing in the doorway. Alaric Montclair stood with his back to her, gazing out a vast window that framed the turbulent Atlantic like a living painting. Even from behind, his presence commanded the room, broad shoulders under an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, dark hair with premature silver at the temples, and a tension in his stance that spoke of a man perpetually braced against an invisible storm. "Please sit, Miss Kalua." He didn't turn. Zaria moved to one of the leather chairs facing an antique desk cluttered with shipping manifests and financial reports. She placed her portfolio on her lap and waited, refusing to be intimidated by the silence he wielded like a weapon. When he finally turned, Zaria fought to maintain her composure. Alaric Montclair's features were sharp and striking, a strong jaw darkened by 5 o'clock shadow, a straight nose, and lips pressed into a permanent line of displeasure. But it was his eyes that captivated her, steel gray like the winter sea, and equally cold. "Your credentials are impressive," he said, finally sitting across from her. "Boston Memorial is one of the finest hospitals in the country. Why leave to care for a mute child in a town most people couldn't locate on a map? The question was barbed, designed to unsettle her. Zarya met his gaze steadily. I believe healing happens beyond hospital walls, Mr. Montclair, and I don't see mutism as a deficit, but as a different form of communication. She leaned forward slightly. Children who don't speak still have volumes to say. Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, before the mask of indifference returned. Nereus hasn't spoken a word since his mother died 3 years ago. 4 specialists have declared it psychological, not physical. 3 nannies have quit. He picked up her resume. What makes you think you'll succeed where others have failed? I don't approach children as puzzles to be solved, Mr. Montclair. I meet them where they are. Zarya's voice softened. Sometimes silence is the only safe place a child can find. Alaric's jaw tightened. This is a temporary position, 6 months at most until I can arrange something more. Permanent? The implication was clear. She wasn't what he wanted, merely what necessity demanded. Of course, Zarya nodded, maintaining her dignity. May I meet Nereus? For the first time, uncertainty crossed Alaric's features. He's in the solarium with his tutor. They should be finishing soon. He checked his watch, a gesture Zarya suspected was more habit than necessity. Mrs. Fletcher will show you to your quarters. You'll start tomorrow. Nereus rises at 7. He takes breakfast in the kitchen, not the dining room. He stood abruptly, dismissal clear in every line of his body. Mr. Montclair. Zarya remained seated. I'd like to know about Nereus's interests, what he enjoys, what comforts him. Alaric paused, caught off guard by the simple question. He ran a hand through his hair, momentarily disheveling its perfect arrangement. He dot. He faltered, and Zarya glimpsed the pain he tried so hard to conceal. He draws, constantly, and he watches the ocean. He has a collection of shells and sea glass. His voice softened almost imperceptibly. He used to love music, before. The unspoken weight of those 2 words, before everything shattered, hung in the air between them. Thank you, Zarya said quietly. That helps. Mrs. Fletcher reappeared at the door, and Alaric retreated behind his wall of formality. Good day, Miss Kahlua. Zarya followed the housekeeper upstairs, through winding corridors that seemed designed to disorient. The East Wing, she gathered from Mrs. Fletcher's sparse commentary, contained the family's private quarters, while her room was in the South Wing overlooking the gardens, and beyond them, the sea. The boys' room is down that hallway, Mrs. Fletcher pointed. Mr. Montclair's suite is in the West Wing. He values his privacy above all else. Zarya nodded, already mapping the emotional geography of this place. A family fragmented, each member isolated in their separate corner of grief. Her room was unexpectedly lovely, airy and bright with seafoam green walls, a canopied bed, and French doors opening onto a small balcony. It was the first space in the mansion that felt alive. Dinner is at 6 in the kitchen for staff, Mrs. Fletcher informed her. The boy eats at 5. Mr. Montclair rarely dines at home. After the housekeeper left, Zarya set down her suitcase and stepped onto the balcony. The wind immediately embraced her, carrying the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below. In the distance, the lighthouse at Clearwater Cove stood sentinel, its beam not yet visible in the late afternoon sun. A movement below caught her eye. In the garden, a small figure sat alone on a stone bench, head bent over what appeared to be a sketchbook. Even from this distance, Zarya could see the intensity of his concentration, the careful way he held his pencil. Nereus. His dark hair fell across his forehead as he worked, occasionally lifted by the breeze. He wore blue shorts and a white button-down shirt that made him look like a miniature version of his father, but his posture lacked Alaric's rigid control. Instead, there was something deeply vulnerable in the curve of his shoulders, the way he hunched protectively over his drawing. Zarya watched him for a moment, her heart already reaching toward this silent child. Then she noticed another figure, Alaric, standing half-hidden behind a topiary, watching his son from a distance. The raw longing on his face, visible only because he thought himself unobserved, struck Zarya like a physical blow. In that moment, she understood her true purpose at Montclair Estate. She wasn't just here to care for a child who couldn't speak, but to help heal a family that had forgotten how to reach for one another across the chasm of loss. As if sensing her gaze, Alaric suddenly looked up. Their eyes met across the distance, and something electric passed between them. Recognition, challenge, possibility. Alaric quickly shuttered his expression and turned away, disappearing among the hedges. Zarya remained on the balcony, the sea breeze whispering promises against her skin. This silent shore might seem desolate, but beneath the surface, powerful currents stirred, currents that could either pull them all under or carry them to unexpected shores. Tomorrow she would begin the delicate work of listening to all that remained unspoken in this house of whispers. Chapter 2. Fortress of Solitude. Morning light streamed through the French doors of Zarya's room, coaxing her from dreams filled with gray eyes and silent children. She rose early, taking care with her appearance, a simple emerald blouse tucked into tailored black pants, her dark braids swept into an elegant updo. Professional, yet approachable, armor for the day ahead. The mansion stirred to life around her as she made her way downstairs, following the scent of coffee and fresh bread. In the massive kitchen, Mrs. Fletcher efficiently directed two younger staff members in breakfast preparations. "Good morning," Zarya offered warmly. Mrs. Fletcher merely nodded. "The boy takes his breakfast at the window nook. Orange juice, no pulp. Oatmeal with brown sugar on the side, never mixed in. Toast cut into triangles, not rectangles." Zarya absorbed these details, not just instructions, but glimpses into Nereus's world, his small assertions of preference in a life where so much control had been stripped away. "And Mr. Montclair," she asked, "takes coffee in his study at 6, breakfast meeting in town at 7. Mrs. Fletcher's tone suggested this routine was as immutable as the tides. "He left instructions for you on the counter." The note was brief, the handwriting strong and slanted. "Miss Kaluwa, Nereus has lessons from 9 to 12. Use afternoon for assessment. Weekly schedule in his room. A.M. No pleasantries, no welcome, just commands issued from a distance." Zarya folded the note, tucking it into her pocket as the kitchen door swung open. Nereus Montclair stood frozen in the doorway, his presence so quiet it seemed to create silence rather than disturb it. In person, the resemblance to his father was striking, the same proud jaw, straight nose, and intelligent eyes. But where Alaric's were stormy gray, Nereus's were a deep, thoughtful blue, his mother's legacy, perhaps. He wore navy shorts and a crisp white shirt, his dark hair neatly combed. Only his untied shoelaces hinted at the child beneath the formal exterior. Zarya smiled, not too broadly, and knelt to his eye level. "Good morning, Nereus. I'm Zarya." She extended her hand slowly. "I'll be staying here to help take care of you." The boy's gaze was direct and assessing, far older than his 8 years. He didn't take her hand, but he didn't retreat either. Progress of a sort. "Would you like to show me where you like to sit for breakfast?" she asked, standing and gesturing toward the kitchen's sunny alcove. Nereus moved to the window nook, climbing onto the cushioned bench with practiced ease. He pointed to the chair opposite him. An invitation, or perhaps just acknowledgement of routine. Zarya brought his breakfast, arranged exactly as Mrs. Fletcher had specified. She noticed how his eyes darted to the perfect triangles of toast, checking that order had been maintained. "I hear you're quite the artist," she said conversationally, pouring her own coffee. "I used to draw when I was your age, mostly the ocean. My grandmother lived by the sea in South Carolina." Nereus stirred his oatmeal methodically, neither acknowledging nor rejecting her words, but Zarya noticed his spoon paused briefly at the mention of the ocean. "Maybe you could show me your drawings sometime. Only if you want to," she added, sipping her coffee. A flicker of consideration crossed his face before he returned to his breakfast. Not a yes, but not a no. In the language of silence, Nereus spoke. This was practically a conversation. After breakfast, Zarya accompanied him to the library where his tutor, a bespectacled young man named Mr. Hayes, waited with textbooks and a gentle smile. Nereus settled at a polished desk by the window, opening his notebook with careful precision. "He communicates through writing for lessons," Mr. Hayes explained quietly to Zarya. "His academic progress is exceptional, particularly in mathematics and science. Literature is," he hesitated, "more challenging emotionally." Zarya understood the unspoken meaning. Stories meant feelings, and feelings were the dangerous currents Nereus avoided navigating. While Nereus studied, Zarya took the opportunity to explore the mansion. Each room told the story of a family fractured. The formal dining room with its tables set for 12, but dust on the china. The music room with a grand piano, its lid closed like a sealed tomb. A sunroom filled with thriving plants that seemed to be the only living things permitted to grow freely within these walls. She paused at a partially open door, drawn by the scent of oil paint and turpentine. Inside was clearly Seraphina's studio, preserved like a shrine. Canvases lined the walls, seascapes mostly, rendered in bold, passionate strokes. The opposite of Alaric's controlled precision. A half-finished painting remained on the easel, the palette beside it long dried, brushes still soaking in a jar as if their owner had just stepped away momentarily. "That room is off limits." Alaric's voice behind her made Zarya start. She turned to find him standing in the hallway, his expression thunderous. She hadn't heard him return to the house. "I apologize," she said evenly, stepping away from the door. "I was familiarizing myself with Nereus's environment. My wife's studio is not part of my son's environment. Not anymore." The words were clipped, each one carved from ice. "Children need connections to those they've lost, Mr. Montclair. Severing them entirely can—" "I didn't hire you for parenting advice, Miss Kahlua." He moved past her to firmly close the studio door. "I hired you to establish a routine for my son while I secure a permanent arrangement." The dismissal stung, but Zarya held her ground. "With respect, sir, I was hired to care for Nereus. That includes his emotional well-being." Something dangerous flashed in Alaric's eyes. For a moment, Zarya thought he might dismiss her on the spot. Instead, his gaze traveled over her face, lingering on her eyes, her lips, before he stepped back, regaining his composure. "My son's emotional well-being is not up for discussion." His voice had dropped lower, almost intimate in its intensity. "Especially not in hallways." The air between them seemed to vibrate with unspoken tension. Anger, certainly, but something else too, something Zarya wasn't prepared to name. "3 o'clock in my study," Alaric said abruptly. "We'll establish boundaries then." He turned and strode away, leaving Zarya breathless, as if she'd run a great distance. She pressed a hand to her chest, willing her heartbeat to slow. This man was infuriating, controlling, wounded beyond measure, and yet there was something in his fierce protection of his pain that called to the healer in her. "Dangerous territory," she warned herself. "Remember why you're here." After lunch, which Nereus took alone at the small kitchen table, Zarya sitting nearby with her own sandwich, she accompanied him to his room for what Mrs. Fletcher called quiet time. Nereus's bedroom revealed more of the boy than any interaction could. Model ships hung from the ceiling. Bookshelves overflowed with volumes on marine biology, astronomy, and adventure tales. One wall featured a massive map of the world's oceans, dotted with colored pins. But most telling was the window seat, piled with cushions and offering a panoramic view of the Atlantic, a perfect lookout post for a child standing sentinel. "This is a wonderful room," Zarya said honestly. "Did you choose the ships?" Nereus nodded once, then moved to his desk where a leather-bound sketchbook lay. He opened it, hesitated, then turned it toward Zarya. The gesture nearly took her breath away. This first voluntary communication was more significant than any word could be. The drawing showed the lighthouse at Clearwater Cove, rendered with surprising skill for an 8-year-old. But it was the perspective that struck Zarya. The lighthouse seen from below, from the vantage point of someone in troubled waters, looking towards safety. "This is beautiful," she said softly. "You really captured the light." Nereus turned the page, revealing another drawing. This one of a woman standing on the cliffs, her long hair and dress billowing in the wind. Though depicted from behind, the loneliness of the figure radiated from the page. His mother. It had to be. Nereus watched Zarya carefully, gauging her reaction, testing her. "She looks like she's listening to the ocean," Zarya observed gently. Was that something she liked to do? The boy's eyes widened slightly, surprised by her perception. He nodded, then quickly closed the sketchbook, the moment of sharing over. When she left him to rest, Zarya found herself drawn to the cliff path, visible from her balcony. The sea air cleared her head as she walked, processing the complexities of this household, a father walled off in his grief, a son lost in silence, and the ghost of a woman whose presence still filled every corner. At precisely 3 o'clock, she knocked on Alaric's study door. "Enter." This time, he faced her immediately, standing behind his desk like a general preparing for battle. But something had shifted since their hallway encounter. He gestured to a chair, his movements less rigid. "Mrs. Fletcher tells me Nereus showed you his drawings." No preamble, just direct assessment. "He hasn't done that with previous caregivers." "Children sense when adults truly see them," Zarya said simply. "Not as problems to be fixed, but as people navigating loss the best way they know how." Alaric's expression tightened. "You seem to have many opinions about loss, Miss Kalua." "I've had experience with it." She met his gaze steadily. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 12. My grandmother raised me." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps even respect. He sat down, the defensive edge in his posture softening marginally. "What do you recommend for Nereus's afternoon activities?" he asked, the question a subtle acknowledgement of her expertise. Time outdoors would benefit him. The garden, perhaps the beach below the cliffs if there's safe access. Physical activity helps process emotional energy. Children can't verbalize. Alaric nodded slowly. "There's a private cove. Steps were cut into the cliff decades ago." He hesitated. "Serafina used to take him there daily." The mention of his wife's name seemed to surprise even him. He looked away quickly, shuffling papers on his desk. "And you, Mr. Montclair?" Zarya asked gently. "When was the last time you visited the cove?" His head snapped up, eyes flashing. "My schedule is not your concern." "Nereus's healing is my concern," she replied. "And children heal best when the adults around them model healthy grieving." For a moment, raw pain transformed Alaric's face, stripping away the controlled facade. Zarya glimpsed the true depth of his suffering, not cold indifference, but agony so acute he'd armored himself against it. "That will be all, Miss Kalua." His voice was hoarse. Zarya stood, understanding she'd pushed too far, too soon. At the door, she paused. Children who stop speaking often do so because they believe their words could hurt others, or because they think no one is truly listening. Sometimes, Mr. Montclair, silence isn't about what remains unsaid, but about what remains unheard. She left him staring after her, the fortress of his solitude momentarily breached by a truth he wasn't ready to face, that in trying to protect his son from pain, he had isolated them both in separate towers of the same lonely castle. Chapter 3. The Storm. Within 2 weeks passed at Montclair Estate, each day following the rhythm established by Alaric's rigid scheduling and Zaria's gentle persistence. Mornings were for lessons, afternoons for what Zaria had come to think of as healing time, walks in the garden, supervised exploration of the private beach, and quiet moments with sketchbooks and colored pencils. Nereus remained silent, but his body language had begun to soften around Zaria. Small victories emerged, a spontaneous smile when she identified a rare shell, an extra drawing left on her breakfast plate, the way he now walked close enough that sometimes their shadows merged on the garden path. Alaric remained a more distant challenge. He appeared at breakfast occasionally, disappeared for long business trips, and when present maintained a careful distance, watching Zaria's interactions with his son with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Suspicion mingled with something that might have been hope, quickly suppressed. On Friday evening, Zaria sat on her balcony, writing in her journal. The sky had darkened ominously throughout the afternoon, the air electric with approaching thunder. Now the wind whipped at her pages as the first fat raindrops began to fall. A knock at her door pulled her inside. Mrs. Fletcher stood in the hallway, her perpetual frown deepened by genuine concern. Storm warnings been issued. Hurricane moving up the coast faster than expected. The housekeeper's eyes darted toward the windows where rain now lashed against the glass. Mr. Montclair called. He's trying to get back from Portland, but the roads may be closed. Where's Nereus? Zaria asked, immediately alert. In his room. He's... Mrs. Fletcher hesitated. Storms are difficult for him, since the accident. Accident? Mrs. Fletcher's expression closed. Not my place to say, just... He needs checking on. The other staff have gone home before roads flood. As the housekeeper hurried away to secure the lower floors, Zaria made her way to Nereus's room. She knocked gently before entering. The boy wasn't in his bed or at his desk. For a moment, panic fluttered in her chest until a flash of lightning illuminated a small figure huddled in the window seat, knees drawn to his chest, hands pressed over his ears. Nereus, she said softly, approaching slowly. It's just a storm. You're safe inside. Another thunderclap rattled the windows, and Nereus squeezed his eyes shut, his breathing rapid and shallow. Zaria recognized the signs of a panic attack beginning. She sat beside him, not touching but close enough that he could feel her presence. I'm going to count, and I'd like you to try to breathe with me. Can you do that? 1, 2, 3. Gradually, his breathing slowed to match her counting. Outside, the storm intensified, wind howling around the corners of the mansion like a living thing seeking entry. Would you like to build a fort? Zaria asked suddenly. When I was scared during storms, my grandmother and I would make a blanket fort and tell stories inside. Nereus looked at her with uncertainty, but when another crash of thunder came, he nodded quickly. Together they transformed his bedroom, dragging the comforter from his bed, securing it to the bookcase and desk chair, creating a cave of safety lined with pillows. Zaria found flashlights in his closet, and soon they sat inside their creation, the soft glow illuminating their faces from below. This is much better, isn't it? Zaria smiled. Storms can't get us in here. Nereus nodded, his face relaxing slightly. Then his eyes widened in alarm as the lights flickered once, twice, and plunged the mansion into darkness. Only their flashlights remained, small islands of light in the sudden sea of black. It's okay, Zarya reassured him, her voice calm despite the darkness. The power will come back soon, and we have our flashlights. She could see panic rising again in his eyes, his small body tensing with each gust of wind that made the windows groan. Without thinking, Zarya began to sing, a lullaby her mother had sung to her, passed down through generations. Her voice was rich and warm, filling their small fortress with gentle sound that somehow stood against the storm's fury. Hush now, little one, close your weary eyes. Stars keep watch above you as the moon begins to rise. Waves may crash on distant shores, winds may bend the trees, but you are safe within my heart, as peaceful as the seas. As she sang, Nereus's shoulders gradually lowered, his breathing steadied. He looked at her with wonder, as if she had performed some kind of magic. His fingers began to twitch slightly against his knee, unconsciously moving as if pressing invisible piano keys. My mother sang this to me when I was afraid, Zarya explained softly. And her mother sang it to her. Songs are like that. They carry love across time, even when the people we love aren't with us anymore. Nereus's eyes filled with tears that didn't fall. He reached for his sketchbook, always kept within arm's reach, and quickly drew something. When he turned it toward her, Zarya's heart constricted. A simple sketch showed a woman sitting on the edge of a bed, musical notes floating around her head as she looked down at a small boy. "Your mother sang to you," Zarya whispered. Nereus nodded, one tear finally escaping to track down his cheek. "She still loves you, you know." Zarya kept her voice gentle. "Love doesn't stop, even when people have to leave us." The boy's face crumpled, and for the first time he moved toward her, not quite touching but seeking proximity in a way he hadn't before. Zarya carefully extended her arm, offering comfort without demanding it. After a moment's hesitation, Nereus leaned against her side. The contact was feather-light at first, then more trusting as Zarya remained still, honoring the magnitude of this gesture. "Would you like to hear another song?" she asked. He nodded against her arm, and Zarya began to sing again, this time a playful tune about sea creatures dancing beneath the waves. By the third verse, she felt some of the tension leave his small frame. Neither of them noticed the study door had opened slightly, or that Alaric Montclair stood frozen in the hallway, rainwater still dripping from his coat, his face illuminated by a flash of lightning. He had driven through the storm, fighting flooded roads and downed trees, consumed by fear for his son's safety during the unexpected hurricane. Now he stood transfixed, watching as this woman he barely knew sang his terrified child back from the edge of panic. The lullaby pierced him like a physical pain. Serafina had sung that very song, though with different words. The melody unlocked something in his chest, a door he'd kept firmly sealed for 3 years. Inside the fort, Zarya felt Nereus grow heavier against her side as exhaustion began to claim him. "Let's get you into bed," she said softly. "The storm will pass by morning." As she helped the drowsy boy to his feet, the fort collapsed around them, sending Nereus into a sudden, startled panic. He grabbed Zarya's hand, the first time he had reached for her, just as another thunderclap shook the house. "It's all right," Alaric's voice came from the doorway, steady and deep. "I'm here." "Dad," Nereus mouthed the word silently, surprise and relief washing over his features. Zarya stepped back as Alaric moved through the darkness with surprising grace, kneeling before his son. "Are you okay, champion?" Nereus nodded, though his grip on Zarya's hand tightened. Something shifted in Alaric's expression as he noticed this connection. Not jealousy, as Zarya had feared, but a complex emotion she couldn't quite name. Relief, perhaps, tinged with wonder. "Miss Kalua has been taking good care of you?" he asked softly. Nereus nodded again, more emphatically. "We made a fort," Zarya explained, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look, her braids coming loose. Nereus's comforter still draped over her shoulders like a cape. It helps with the thunder. Alaric's eyes moved to her face, lingering there with unexpected warmth. I remember forts, he said, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it. Your mother used to build them with you during summer storms. Nereus's eyes widened at the mention of his mother, darting between his father's face and Zaria's as if trying to understand this unprecedented moment. Let's get you into bed, Alaric said, standing and lifting his son with practiced ease despite his formal clothes. Zaria began gathering the fallen blankets, intending to rebuild the bed, but Alaric shook his head. Leave it for now. His voice was low, meant only for her. Would you mind staying until he falls asleep? The vulnerability in the request stunned her. Of course. When Nereus was tucked beneath fresh blankets from the linen closet, Zaria sat on one side of his bed, Alaric on the other. The boy's eyes were heavy, but fear still tensed his body with each crash of thunder. Perhaps another song, Alaric suggested, his eyes meeting Zaria's across the bed. She nodded, surprised, and began singing the lullaby again. After the first verse, Alaric's voice joined hers, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence. His baritone blended with her alto, creating harmonies that filled the darkened room with unexpected beauty. Nereus's eyes widened briefly at the sound of his father's voice, singing for the first time in years, then slowly closed as sleep finally claimed him. The song ended, but neither adult moved, watching the rise and fall of the boy's chest as he slipped deeper into dreams. I didn't know you could sing, Zaria whispered. I didn't know I still could, Alaric admitted, his voice rough with emotion. He stood abruptly. Thank you for caring for him. I should never have been away with this storm coming. You couldn't have known, Zaria said, following him into the hallway, pulling the door nearly closed behind them. The hurricane changed course suddenly. In the corridor, lit only by the beam of her flashlight and occasional flashes of lightning through the windows, Alaric looked different, less the cold businessman, more the frightened father who had driven through a hurricane to reach his son. He held your hand, Alaric said, wonder threading through his voice. He hasn't reached for anyone since his mother died, Zaria finished gently. Mr. Montclair, what happened during the storm that frightens him so much? Alaric turned away, his profile sharp against the window where rain still pounded relentlessly. For a moment, Zaria thought he would retreat behind his walls again. Serafina died during a storm like this, he said finally, the words emerging as if they caused him physical pain. Not in the storm itself. She was already ill, but she slipped away while thunder shook the house. Nereus was holding her hand when she took her last breath. The magnitude of this revelation stole Zaria's breath. No wonder the boy had stopped speaking, if those were the last moments he'd shared with his mother. I'm so sorry, she whispered, instinctively reaching to touch Alaric's arm. He stiffened at the contact but didn't pull away. For several heartbeats they stood in silence, connected by this simple touch as the storm raged beyond the windows. Finally, Alaric stepped back, composure returning like armor being locked into place. It's late. You should rest. And you? Zaria asked, suddenly concerned by the exhaustion evident in the lines of his face. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I have calls to make, storm damage to assess. The calls can wait until morning, she said firmly. You drove through a hurricane tonight. You need sleep as much as Nereus does. Alaric's eyes widened slightly at her directness. You're very forthright, Miss Kalua. Zaria, she corrected gently. If we're going to sing lullabies together, I think you might use my first name, at least when we're not being formal. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight relaxation of his jaw. Zarya, he repeated, as if testing how it felt on his tongue. Thank you for being here for him tonight. That's why you hired me, she reminded him with a small smile. Alaric shook his head slightly. I hired a caregiver. I didn't expect. He trailed off, gesturing vaguely toward Nereus's room, where their songs still seemed to echo. Good night, Mr. Montclair, Zarya said, sensing his discomfort with the moment's intimacy. Alaric, he corrected, surprising her, when we're not being formal. Their eyes met in the darkness, and Zarya felt something dangerous and wonderful unfurl in her chest, a recognition that something had fundamentally changed between them, as surely as the storm had altered the landscape outside. Good night, Alaric, she said softly, turning toward her own room before he could see the flush rising to her cheeks. Behind her, his voice was almost too quiet to hear. Good night, Zarya. As she slipped into her room, Zarya pressed a hand to her racing heart. The storm outside was beginning to abate, but she sensed that another kind of storm, one far more complex and thrilling, was just beginning to gather force within the walls of Montclair Estate. Chapter 4. Awakening Hearts. The morning after the storm dawned impossibly clear, as if the tempest had scrubbed the world clean. Zarya stood on her balcony, surveying the changed landscape. Branches scattered across the lawn, sea water pooled in garden depressions, and along the cliff edge, a massive oak had surrendered to the wind, its ancient roots exposed to the sky like grasping fingers. Yet amid the destruction, beauty emerged. Raindrops glittered on spider webs strung between rose bushes. The air carried the sharp, vital scent of ozone and salt. The world felt newborn. Inside the mansion, something had shifted as well. When Zarya entered the kitchen, she found Nereus already at the window nook, but not alone. Alaric sat opposite his son, the Wall Street Journal folded beside his coffee cup, his attention fully fixed on Nereus's latest drawing. Good morning, Zarya said, surprised by this deviation from routine. Alaric looked up, and for a brief moment his expression was unguarded, something warm and appreciative crossing his features before professional distance partially reasserted itself. The storm had changed something in him. Though still reserved, the ice in his demeanor had begun to thaw. Miss Kalua. He nodded, then corrected himself. Zarya, I was just telling Nereus that school is cancelled today due to storm damage. Nereus glanced up at her entrance, offering a small but distinct smile that made her heart swell. Gone was the wary, withdrawn child of yesterday. Something had unlocked during the night's storm, not speech, not yet, but connection. Then we have a free day ahead of us, Zarya said, pouring herself coffee. Any suggestions? To her surprise, it was Alaric who answered. I've postponed my meetings. I thought perhaps. He cleared his throat, suddenly uncertain. The storm will have washed up interesting specimens on the beach. Nereus might enjoy exploring. That sounds wonderful, Zarya agreed, catching the flash of excitement in Nereus's eyes. A family expedition. Alaric stiffened slightly at the word family, but nodded. I need to assess the damage to the boat dock anyway. After breakfast, they prepared for their excursion. Zarya changed into jeans and a lightweight sweater. When she emerged from her room, she found Nereus waiting in the hallway, a child-sized tackle box in his hands. His collection kit, she realized. Alaric appeared from the direction of the West Wing, transformed by casual clothes, khaki pants and a blue chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms dusted with dark hair. Without his business armor, he looked younger, less forbidding, almost approachable. Their eyes met, a mutual appreciation passing between them before both quickly looked away. The shared experience during the storm had created an unspoken connection, tentative but undeniable. The path to the private cove involved wooden stairs cut into the cliff face, reinforced with iron railings. The storm had damaged several sections, requiring careful navigation. At a particularly precarious stretch, Alaric lifted Nereus effortlessly, carrying him past the danger. Then, to Zaria's surprise, he extended his hand to her. "The third step is loose," he explained, his voice carefully neutral. She placed her hand in his, feeling calluses she hadn't expected from a man who spent his days in boardrooms. His grip was warm and secure as he steadied her over the broken step. The contact lasted only seconds, but left her skin tingling long after they continued downward. The cove revealed itself gradually, a perfect crescent of sand sheltered by rocky outcroppings on either side. The storm had transformed it, littering the normally pristine beach with seaweed, driftwood, and countless shells displaced from the ocean floor. "Treasure," Zaria declared, watching Nereus's eyes widen at the bounty before them. "Where should we start?" The boy pointed toward the water's edge where the retreating tide was still depositing new offerings. For the next hour they combed the beach, Nereus filling his collection box with carefully selected specimens. Iridescent shell fragments, sea glass smoothed by years of tumbling waves, perfectly formed sand dollars. Alaric moved more purposefully toward the small dock jutting from the south end of the cove. Zaria watched him surreptitiously as he examined damaged planking, making notes on his phone, occasionally glancing back to check on Nereus's location. Though his attention appeared divided, she noticed how his gaze lingered on his son, drinking in the boy's rare animation with hungry eyes. When Nereus discovered a tide pool teeming with life, tiny crabs, translucent shrimp, anemones waving lazy tentacles, he gestured urgently for Zaria to join him. Together they knelt beside the natural aquarium, Zaria identifying creatures she recognized while asking Nereus about those she didn't. He responded by sketching quick images in the wet sand beside the pool, adding scientific names with his fingertip. "You know so much about ocean life," Zaria marveled. "Did you learn this from books?" Nereus shook his head, then pointed toward the dock where Alaric stood silhouetted against the morning sky. "Your father taught you?" she asked, surprised. The boy nodded, adding another detail to his sand drawing, a small boat beside a figure that could only be Alaric. Understanding dawned. "You used to go boating together, to study marine life." Another nod, this one accompanied by a shadow crossing his expressive features. "But not since your mother died," Zaria guessed softly. Nereus looked down, using a shell to create intricate patterns in the sand. He wasn't withdrawing, exactly, but retreating to safer emotional territory. After a moment, he traced what looked like musical notes in the wet sand before quickly erasing them with his palm. She glanced toward Alaric again, seeing him with new eyes. Not just the grieving widower, the driven businessman, but a father who had once spent days teaching his son about the wonders of the sea. A man who had lost not only his wife but parts of himself. Later, as the sun climbed higher, they gathered on a large piece of driftwood. Zaria unpacked the simple lunch Mrs. Fletcher had prepared, sandwiches, fruit, and lemonade in a thermal container. The domesticity of the moment struck her, how easily they had fallen into this approximation of family. "The dock needs significant repair," Alaric said, breaking a comfortable silence. "The pylons are still sound, but several planks were torn away." "Was that your boat that was damaged in the marina?" Zaria asked, remembering the news report she'd glimpsed that morning. He nodded. "Just cosmetic damage, fortunately. Nothing that can't be fixed." His words hung in the salt-laden air, carrying weight beyond their surface meaning. Nereus looked up sharply, studying his father's face with sudden intensity. "Do you miss sailing?" Zaria asked carefully. Alaric's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I miss many things." The raw honesty in his voice created a shift in the atmosphere between them. Nereus set down his sandwich and pulled his ever-present sketchbook from his pocket. His pencil moved rapidly across the page. When he turned it toward them, both adults fell silent. The drawing showed three figures on a boat: a man at the wheel, a boy pointing excitedly toward something in the water, and a woman standing between them, one hand on the boy's shoulder, the other reaching toward the man. The meaning was unmistakable. Alaric's expression froze, pain flashing across his features before he carefully controlled them. "That's very good, Nereus. The perspective is excellent." The boy's eyes searched his father's face, hope and disappointment warring in his gaze. "We should collect your specimens before the tide rises further," Alaric said, standing abruptly. He moved down the beach, his shoulders rigid with tension. Zarya touched Nereus's arm gently. "That was very brave," she whispered. "Sometimes adults need time to understand big feelings." Nereus nodded solemnly, closing his sketchbook with careful precision. The easy camaraderie of the morning had evaporated. Though they spent another hour exploring the cove, Alaric maintained careful distance, his responses polite but guarded. When they finally climbed back up the cliff stairs, he immediately excused himself, citing urgent business calls. "Your father isn't angry," Zarya assured Nereus as they arranged his beach treasures on the garden table. "He's just afraid of how much he still feels." The boy arranged his shells in precise rows, organizing them by size and color. Then he selected a perfect spiral shell, small enough to fit in a palm, and placed it deliberately in front of Zarya. "For me?" she asked. Nereus nodded, then picked up a similar shell and made a gesture of giving. "You want me to give this to your father?" she guessed. Another nod, more emphatic this time. "I'll try," she promised, "but I can't make him accept it." That evening, after Nereus was settled with a book in bed, Zarya found herself outside Alaric's study, the shell a smooth weight in her palm. She knocked softly. "Come in," he called, his voice weary. He sat behind his desk, papers spread before him, but his eyes were distant, unfocused. When he saw Zarya, he straightened, composure settling over his features like a familiar coat. "Is Nereus all right?" "He's fine, reading before sleep." She approached slowly. "He wanted you to have this." She placed the shell on his desk. Alaric stared at it, throat working. "Why?" "I think it's his way of holding on to today," Zarya said, "even though things became difficult." Alaric picked up the shell, turning it between his fingers. "I don't know how to give him what he wants." "What do you think he wants?" "A family. Wholeness." His laugh was hollow. "The very things I can't provide." "You are his family, Alaric. You're still here." "Am I?" His gaze met hers, raw with self-recrimination. "I've been hiding in meetings and endless work while my son drowns in silence." "But today you went to the beach," Zarya reminded him. "You looked at tide pools and ate sandwiches and saw your son smile. That matters." Alaric stood, moving to the window. "One good day doesn't erase 3 years of failure." "No," she agreed, "but it can be the first of many better days." He turned to face her, moonlight illuminating half his face while leaving the other in shadow, a visual representation of the man himself, caught between past and future, darkness and light. "The drawing," he said abruptly. "You were in it." "Yes." There was no point denying it. "Nereus has known you for a week. Children recognize when adults truly care," she said carefully. "Not just about them, but about those they love. And you care about my son." It wasn't quite a question. "I do." Zarya met his gaze steadily. "More than I expected to." Something unspoken passed between them, a current of awareness neither was ready to name. Alaric moved closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, smell the faint cedar of his cologne. "I should thank you," he said, voice dropping lower, for bringing music back into this house, for making my son feel safe, for seeing what I couldn't. I just did what felt right, Zaria replied, conscious of her quickening pulse. It's been so long since anything felt right in this house, he whispered, since anything felt right at all. The air between them hummed with possibility. Zaria knew she should step back, maintain professional distance. Instead, she remained still as Alaric slowly raised his hand toward her face, hesitating just before touching her. In his eyes she read conflict, desire warring with guilt, longing battling propriety. I should go, she said softly, giving him the escape they both needed. Good night, Alaric. Relief and disappointment mingled in his expression as he lowered his hand. His ocean blue eyes, not quite the stormy gray they appeared in shadow, held a question he wasn't ready to ask. Good night, Zaria. At the door, she turned back. He stood in the moonlight, the shell cradled in his palm like something precious and fragile. Today was just the beginning, she said. Nereus is waking up, finding his courage again. The question is whether his father is brave enough to do the same. She slipped away before he could respond, her words hanging in the air behind her. A challenge, an invitation, a recognition of the awakening hearts within Montclair estate, still trembling on the precipice between slumber and full consciousness. Chapter 5. Legacy of Loss. 2 weeks passed in a dance of progress and retreat. Nereus blossomed under Zaria's care, sketching more freely, his gestures more animated, occasionally responding with written notes rather than just nods. Alaric, however, remained guarded. Though he joined them for breakfast more regularly, he maintained careful distance from Zaria, as if their moonlit moment had erected new barriers rather than dissolved old ones. On a brilliant Saturday morning, Zaria was helping Nereus arrange his shell collection when Mrs. Fletcher appeared at the sunroom door. Mr. Montclair requests your presence in the East Garden, the housekeeper announced. He said to bring the boy as well. They found Alaric standing beside a picnic blanket, a wicker basket at his feet. He wore casual clothes, dark jeans and a gray sweater with the sleeves rolled up, and his hair was windblown. I thought we might have lunch outside, he said. Mrs. Fletcher mentioned Nereus has been asking about the gardens. The boy's eyes widened with delight. He rushed forward, stopping just short of his father. What do you think, champion? Alaric asked. Will you give me a tour of what you've discovered here? Nereus nodded eagerly, reaching for his father's hand, a gesture so momentous that Zaria held her breath, watching Alaric's reaction. For a heartbeat, Alaric froze. Then his larger hand carefully enfolded his son's, and something in his face softened, years falling away. Lead the way, he said softly. Zaria followed at a distance as Nereus guided his father around the gardens, showing him the robin's nest hidden in the wisteria, the colony of ladybugs beneath the rose bushes, the ancient sundial where snails left silver trails. Alaric listened attentively, asking questions that Nereus answered through gestures and quick sketches. When they settled on the blanket, Alaric unpacked the basket. Sandwiches, fresh fruit, lemonade, and cookies that made Nereus's eyes light up. I had the kitchen make your mother's recipe, Alaric explained. Snickerdoodles with extra cinnamon. Nereus stared at the cookies, then at his father, disbelief and joy warring on his face. It's been a while since we had these, Alaric continued, vulnerability entering his voice. Too long. I thought perhaps it's time to remember some of the good things. The boy reached for a cookie with trembling fingers. When he looked at his father again, there were tears glistening on his lashes. Watching this communion, Zaria felt like an intruder. She began to rise, but Alaric's voice stopped her. Please stay, this involves you too. I owe you both an explanation, Alaric said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. About Seraphina, about what happened. Nereus went very still. his cookie forgotten. Your mother loved the sea more than anyone I've ever known, Alaric told his son. She said it spoke to her, told her secrets about the world. She was diagnosed 6 months before. Alaric swallowed hard. The doctors said there was nothing they could do. A rare cancer, aggressive, untreatable. Serafina didn't want you to know she was dying. She wanted your life to remain normal for as long as possible. That was why we kept sailing, kept exploring tide pools, kept making cookies on Sundays. He paused. The night of the storm, when she left us, she made me promise to keep living, to show you the beauty in the world, to help you remember her with joy, not sorrow. His voice broke. And I failed. I buried myself in work and grief. I kept you safe, but I didn't help you live. I'm so sorry, Nereus. The boy's eyes filled with tears. He took his father's hand, holding it with both of his own. He understands, Zaria said softly. Children understand more than we think, especially about love. Alaric looked at her. And you? Do you understand why I've been so difficult? I understand grief, she replied. I was 12 when my parents died in a car accident. My grandmother became my whole world. When she fell ill last year, I dropped everything to care for her. That's why you left Boston, Alaric realized. A prestigious position meant nothing compared to family, Zaria said, just as your shipping empire means nothing compared to this boy right here. Nereus tugged at his father's sleeve, then pointed at Zaria. He wants to know if you'll stay, Alaric translated. Now that your grandmother is well. My commitment was for 6 months, she reminded them, to give you time to find a permanent arrangement. And if we decided the current arrangement is satisfactory, Alaric's voice was neutral, but his eyes held a question that made her heart race. A shadow fell across the blanket. Mrs. Fletcher stood stiffly at the garden's edge. Mr. Montclair, there's a call for you. Miss Drayton says it's urgent. Alaric's expression closed immediately. Excuse me, he said, rising quickly. Business matter. As he strode away, Zaria turned to Mrs. Fletcher. Who is Miss Drayton? Olympia Drayton Montclair, the housekeeper replied. Mr. Montclair's mother. She calls every Saturday at precisely 1 o'clock. She's arriving next week for her monthly visit, she added. She stays for 3 days, always in the blue suite. Mrs. Fletcher paused. Miss Kalua, Mrs. Drayton Montclair has very specific ideas about suitable caregivers for her grandson. She was instrumental in the departure of the previous 3. With that cryptic statement, the housekeeper departed, leaving Zaria and Nereus alone in the suddenly cooler afternoon. Nereus sketched a sharp-featured woman with a severe bun, her mouth a tight line of disapproval. Around the figure, he added jagged lines suggesting a storm cloud. I take it you and your grandmother don't get along, Zaria said diplomatically. Nereus flipped to a new page and drew a sequence, the woman pointing at him, then at her mouth, her expression angry. She doesn't accept your silence, Zaria understood. He nodded, then added another figure, Alaric, standing between the woman and the boy, his stance protective but his head bowed. Your father tries to shield you, but he struggles to stand up to her completely, Zaria interpreted. Well then, she said with new determination, it seems we have a week to prepare for Hurricane Olympia. This drew a silent giggle from Nereus, easing the worry in his eyes. That evening, after Nereus was asleep, Zaria found herself drawn to the music room. The grand piano dominated the space, its polished surface reflecting moonlight. She would have wanted music to continue in this house, Alaric's voice came from the doorway. I didn't mean to intrude, Zaria said. You're not. He entered, closing the door part way. I had the piano tuned last week. It seemed time. Do you play? He asked. Not well, she admitted. But it comforts me. My grandmother insisted on lessons after my parents died. She said grief needs expression, and music speaks when words fail. Would you play something? He requested. Zaria nodded and began Debussy's Clair de Lune, filling the room with fragile beauty. Serafina loved Debussy, Alaric said when the notes faded. She said his music was like the sea, always changing, always the same. He sat beside her on the bench. Tell me about your parents. Their conversation flowed into the night. Two souls connected by loss, yet drawn to the possibility of something new. When Alaric finally touched her cheek, his fingers trembling slightly, Zaria felt her heart open to a future she hadn't imagined possible when she first arrived at Montclair Estate. But Olympia's impending visit loomed over them like a gathering storm. Chapter 6. Tides of Change. The week before, Olympia's arrival passed with a new undercurrent of tension flowing through Montclair Estate. Alaric spent long hours on calls, his voice sometimes carrying down the hallways in clipped, frustrated tones. Nereus retreated further into his artwork, filling pages with stormy seas and dark clouds. Even Mrs. Fletcher seemed affected, her efficiency taking on a brittle edge as she directed the staff in an exhaustive cleaning of the blue suite. "Has it always been this way before her visits?" Zaria asked Mrs. Peterson, the cook, as they prepared Nereus's lunch together. The older woman glanced toward the doorway before answering. "Worse since Miss Serafina passed. Before, she and Mrs. Drayton Montclair had what you might call a Cold War. Miss Serafina stood her ground, had a backbone of steel beneath all that artist gentleness." She sighed, kneading bread dough with extra force. "Mr. Montclair hasn't been the same since losing her. Lets his mother run roughshod when she visits." Zaria absorbed this information, adding it to her mental picture of the family dynamic. Serafina had been Alaric's shield as well as his heart. Without her, he'd lost not just love but the strength to stand against his mother's formidable will. On Wednesday afternoon, Zaria was helping Nereus with a science experiment, growing crystals in glass jars, when Alaric appeared at the sunroom door. His expression was strained but determined. "I need to speak with you both," he said, closing the door behind him. "About my mother's visit." Nereus's shoulders tensed immediately. "She arrives tomorrow," Alaric continued, sitting across from them at the work table. "I wanted to prepare you, Zaria. My mother can be difficult. Mrs. Fletcher mentioned she has strong opinions about Nereus's caregivers," Zaria replied carefully. Alaric's mouth tightened. "That's putting it mildly. She believes Nereus's selective mutism is willful defiance rather than trauma. She's been pushing for a military-style boarding school, thinking strict discipline will snap him out of it." Horror must have shown on Zaria's face because Alaric quickly added, "I would never allow that, never. But she's persistent and influential." "And what is your plan for this visit?" Zaria asked directly, sensing there was more. Alaric glanced at his son, who watched him with anxious eyes. "I've decided we need to show her Nereus's progress, not by forcing him to speak." He reached across to squeeze the boy's hand reassuringly, but by demonstrating how his other forms of communication have flourished. "You want to impress her," Zaria stated, understanding dawning. "I want to protect my son," he corrected, a flash of the determined CEO showing through his usually guarded demeanor. "And I want to protect you, Zaria." The words sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "Me? My mother will attempt to undermine you. She'll question your qualifications, your methods, your very presence here." His gray eyes held hers steadily. "She'll also likely push for Catherine Blackwood's involvement with Nereus." "The shipping merger candidate," Zaria remembered. "Yes, Catherine is a child psychologist, conveniently enough." The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable. "My mother sees it as the perfect solution. Catherine fixes Nereus while cementing a business alliance. Nereus made a distressed noise in the back of his throat, the closest he'd come to vocalization in Zaria's presence. He grabbed his sketchbook and drew a hasty but clear image of himself hiding behind a door while a faceless woman searched for him. "I won't let that happen," Alaric promised, his voice softening as he addressed his son. "But we need to show grandmother how well you're doing with Zaria. Can you do that? Show her your progress." The boy hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "And you?" Alaric turned to Zaria, vulnerability showing beneath his businesslike exterior. "I have no right to ask, but will you stand with us through this?" "Of course," she replied without hesitation. "I care about Nereus. I won't let anyone push for approaches that might harm his recovery." What remained unspoken hung in the air between them. "And I care about you, too." Alaric exhaled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Thank you. There's one more thing." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "This belonged to Serafina. I'd like you to wear it during my mother's visit." Puzzled, Zaria accepted the box and opened it to find an exquisite pendant, a teardrop pearl suspended from a delicate platinum chain. "It's beautiful," she breathed, "but I don't understand." "Serafina wore it at every formal family gathering," Alaric explained. "It was a gift from my grandfather to my grandmother, then to Serafina. It's a symbol of being welcomed by the Montclair family." Understanding dawned. "You're sending your mother a message." "Several, actually." A hint of the old defiance flickered in his eyes. "That you have my complete trust, that you're not a temporary solution, and that I'm capable of making my own decisions for my family." Nereus watched this exchange with wide eyes, glancing between them with growing hope. "Are you certain?" Zaria asked, knowing how significant this gesture was. "Completely." Alaric's voice left no room for doubt. "May I?" She nodded, heart racing as he took the necklace and moved behind her. His fingers brushed the nape of her neck as he fastened the clasp, sending shivers down her spine. "Perfect," he murmured as she turned to face him again, the pearl warm against her skin. Their eyes held for a long moment, something electric passing between them. The spell was broken by Mrs. Fletcher's sharp knock. "Mr. Montclair, Mr. Blackwood is on the line. He says it's about the Singapore contract." Alaric's jaw tightened. "I have to take this. We'll talk more at dinner." With a final lingering glance at Zaria, he strode from the room. As the door closed behind him, Nereus tugged at Zaria's sleeve. He pointed to the pendant, then to her, his expression questioning. "No, sweetie, this doesn't mean I'm replacing your mother," she said gently, understanding his concern. "No one could ever do that. But it does mean your father wants me to stay and help you both heal." The boy considered this, then carefully sketched a small boat on a calmer sea, 3 figures aboard. He pointed to each in turn, Alaric at the helm, himself in the middle, and Zaria beside them. Then he added a 4th figure, floating in the clouds above, watching over them all, Serafina. Tears pricked Zaria's eyes at the wisdom in this silent child's heart. "That's exactly right," she whispered. "She'll always be with you, even if we become something new together." Nereus nodded, satisfaction and tentative hope in his eyes. That night, as Zaria prepared for bed, thunder rumbled in the distance, a summer storm approaching from the ocean. But unlike the hurricane that had first drawn her and Alaric closer, this storm felt cleansing rather than destructive. Tomorrow would bring Olympia Drayton Montclair and her formidable disapproval. But tonight, Zaria touched the pearl at her throat and felt strangely, wonderfully prepared for battle. The tide was turning at Montclair Estate. Change was coming, as inevitable as the waves reshaping the cliffs below. Chapter 7. Beneath the Surface. Olympia Drayton Montclair arrived precisely at noon, stepping from a chauffeured black sedan with the imperious air of a queen returning to her realm. Tall and regal in a tailored navy suit, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled into an immaculate chignon, she surveyed the estate with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Zarya stood beside Nereus on the front steps, the boy's hand clutching hers tightly. Alaric moved forward to greet his mother, pressing a dutiful kiss to her proffered cheek. "Mother, you're looking well." "Alaric?" Her voice was cultured, cool. "I see the landscaping has improved since my last visit." This, apparently, was high praise, as Alaric's shoulders relaxed marginally. Then Olympia's gaze found Zarya, traveling from her face to the pearl pendant resting at the hollow of her throat. Something dangerous flickered in the older woman's eyes. "And this must be the new caregiver." She pronounced the word as one might say, temporary inconvenience. "Zarya Kalua," Alaric said firmly. "Nurse practitioner, formerly of Boston Memorial. She's been remarkable with Nereus." "Indeed." Olympia moved forward, extending a hand adorned with a massive diamond. "Ms. Kalua, how unexpected to find someone of your caliber in such a remote location." Zarya met the handshake with firm pressure, refusing to be intimidated. "Sometimes the most important healing happens outside hospital walls, Mrs. Drayton Montclair." "Olympia, please." The smile didn't reach her eyes. "We're practically family, aren't we? At least temporarily." The emphasis wasn't lost on anyone. Nereus pressed closer to Zarya's side. "Nereus," Olympia addressed her grandson. "No hello for your grandmother?" The boy inclined his head politely, but made no move to approach her. His fingers tapped a subtle rhythm against his leg. A nervous habit, Zarya had noticed, seemed connected to his suppressed musical inclinations. "Still indulging this silence, I see," Olympia remarked to Alaric, as if Nereus weren't present. "Catherine Blackwood has had tremendous success with similar cases. Perhaps if—" "Nereus has shown remarkable progress with Zarya," Alaric interrupted smoothly. "He's communicating more than ever, just not verbally yet." "Yet being the operative word," Olympia countered. "A child of his background and potential shouldn't be limited to crude drawings and gestures." Zarya felt Nereus flinch beside her. Before she could intervene, Alaric stepped forward, placing a protective hand on his son's shoulder. "Nereus's artwork is hardly crude, Mother. In fact, his art teacher believes he has extraordinary talent. Perhaps he could show you his latest portfolio after lunch." It was a deft sidestep, acknowledging Olympia's concern while redirecting it. Zarya glimpsed the skilled negotiator beneath Alaric's reserved exterior. "Of course," Olympia conceded with a gracious nod. "I'm eager to see any progress." Lunch was a carefully choreographed affair in the formal dining room, crystal and silver gleaming, conversation flowing just above the surface of deeper currents. Olympia dominated the discussion with tales of her social circle in Boston and pointed questions about Alaric's business affairs. "Dominic Blackwood mentioned the Singapore contract is still unresolved," she remarked, cutting her salmon with surgical precision. "He seemed quite confident about acquiring those shipping routes himself." "Dominic always projects confidence," Alaric replied evenly. "The contract remains under negotiation." He glanced at Zarya. "The Blackwoods have been our chief business rivals for decades. There's a long history there." Catherine asked after Nereus, Olympia continued smoothly. "She's quite interested in his case." "Nereus isn't a case, Mother. He's a child recovering from trauma." "A child who needs the best professional help," she countered, her gaze sliding to Zarya. "No offense intended, Ms. Kalua. I'm sure you're quite competent with conventional medical issues." "I've specialized in pediatric trauma recovery for 6 years," Zarya replied calmly. "There's significant research supporting nonverbal therapeutic approaches for children with selective mutism." Pressure to speak often reinforces the trauma response. Olympia's eyebrows rose fractionally. How fascinating. And where exactly did you study child psychology? My nursing doctorate focused on holistic approaches to childhood trauma recovery, Zaria answered. I worked alongside Boston Children's Hospital's psychological team for 3 years. A flicker of surprise crossed Olympia's face before she smoothly redirected. Alaric mentioned you left that position rather abruptly. To care for my grandmother during her illness, Zaria confirmed. Family comes first, particularly in times of crisis. How admirable, Olympia's tone suggested otherwise. And now that your grandmother has recovered? Now I'm exactly where I need to be. Zaria's hand instinctively rose to touch Serafina's pendant. Olympia's eyes narrowed at the gesture. That's an interesting necklace, Ms. Kalua. It looks remarkably like a family heirloom. It is, Alaric interjected, his voice quiet but firm. I gave it to Zaria yesterday. A charged silence fell over the table. Even Nereus held his breath, looking between his father and grandmother. I see. Olympia set down her fork with exaggerated care. How generous of you, Alaric, particularly with something that held such meaning for Serafina. Serafina would approve, he responded, holding his mother's gaze steadily. She valued healing above tradition. The afternoon unfolded with similar undercurrents of tension beneath polite exchanges. Nereus reluctantly showed his grandmother his artwork, receiving tepid praise that focused more on what was missing, his voice, than what was present. When Nereus finally escaped to his room for quiet time, Zaria intended to retreat as well, but Alaric caught her arm in the hallway. I'm sorry, he murmured. She's being exactly as difficult as I feared. I can handle it, Zaria assured him. I face down surgeons with god complexes. Your mother doesn't intimidate me. A smile ghosted across his lips. No, I don't imagine much does. His fingers moved to the pendant at her throat, adjusting it gently. This suits you. The intimate gesture sent warmth cascading through her. Alaric, there you are. Olympia's voice cut between them like a blade. They stepped apart quickly, but not quickly enough to miss her calculating gaze. I've just had the most interesting call from Dominic Blackwood, she continued smoothly. Apparently he's in Clearwater Cove for the weekend and suggested dinner tonight. I took the liberty of accepting on our behalf. Alaric's expression hardened. Mother, we agreed this would be family time. And so it shall be. Olympia's smile was diamond sharp. Catherine will be joining her father. She's so eager to see Nereus again. Nereus isn't comfortable with strangers, Zaria interjected. After the progress he's made, pushing him into a social situation could be detrimental. Nonsense. The boy needs to rejoin society eventually. Olympia turned to Alaric. Unless you intend to keep him isolated forever, with only Ms. Kalua for company. The challenge hung in the air between mother and son. Zaria watched Alaric's internal struggle play across his features, the executive accustomed to placating his formidable mother, warring with the father determined to protect his son. We'll attend, he finally said, but Nereus will remain here with Zaria. Olympia's lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. I hardly think. My decision is final, Mother. Alaric's voice held a new edge of authority. Now, if you'll excuse us, I promise to show Zaria the newly repaired boat dock. Nereus has been asking to visit it. Without waiting for a response, he guided Zaria down the hallway, his hand warm at the small of her back. As they descended the cliff steps toward the cove, Zaria realized this quiet stand against Olympia marked a subtle but significant shift beneath the surface of Montclair Estate, a current of change that even Hurricane Olympia might not be able to withstand. Chapter 8. Shattered Peace. The morning after the tense dinner with the Blackwoods, which Alaric had reported as interminable upon his return, Zarya took Nereus to the cove for their usual exploration. The boy seemed lighter, more relaxed with his grandmother occupied elsewhere, pointing out new shells and sketching the patterns of light through water with growing confidence. As Nereus investigated a tide pool, Zarya looked up to see Alaric approaching along the shore. He'd been absent at breakfast, locked in an early conference call, and his appearance now was an unexpected pleasure. "Peace negotiations with Olympia?" she asked as he reached them. "More like strategic avoidance," he admitted with a wry smile. "She's meeting with her financial advisor in town. We have a few hours of freedom." He knelt beside Nereus, genuinely interested as the boy displayed his latest discovery, a rare violet sea urchin. Watching them together, Zarya was struck by how much had changed in a month. The emotional distance that had once stretched between father and son had narrowed to something close and trusting. Not healed completely, but mending. "I have a surprise," Alaric announced after they'd explored the tide pools. "If you're both agreeable." He gestured toward the repaired dock where a sleek sailboat now bobbed in the gentle waves. Nereus froze, his eyes widening as he stared at the vessel. The sea spirit had been his mother's favorite, Zarya knew. The boat from countless family adventures before Seraphina's illness. "We don't have to," Alaric said gently, noticing his son's hesitation. "But I thought perhaps it's time we remembered how much joy the sea once brought us." Nereus looked from the boat to his father, then to Zarya, his expression a complex mixture of fear and longing. Slowly he nodded, taking a step toward the dock. "Are you sure?" Zarya asked, concerned about pushing too far. "Too fast?" "No," Alaric admitted quietly. "But Seraphina would say nothing worth doing comes with certainty." Together they boarded the sailboat, Alaric helping them both with practiced ease. The vessel was immaculate, clearly maintained despite years of disuse. Nereus moved about the deck with the muscle memory of a child who had once been comfortable on water, trailing his fingers over polished wood and gleaming metal. "She's beautiful," Zarya said, admiring the craftsmanship. "Seraphina chose her," Alaric replied, his voice warm with memory rather than laden with grief. "Said she had a good soul." He smiled at Zarya's questioning look. My practical engineer's mind couldn't argue with that mystical artist's logic. The sea spirit always did handle like she had a personality. As they sailed along the coastline, something magical happened. Nereus blossomed, his body language transforming from tentative to confident. He helped his father with the rigging, anticipated turns, and seemed to read the wind as naturally as Seraphina once had. He positioned himself at the bow, face lifted to the salt spray, the closest to joyful Zarya had ever seen him. "I'd forgotten this," Alaric said softly, standing close beside Zarya at the wheel. "How alive he is on the water." "He's his mother's son," Zarya observed. "And his father's," Alaric corrected. "The sea is in the Montclair blood, has been for generations." They sailed for 2 hours, Alaric pointing out landmarks along the coast, sharing stories of previous voyages that made Nereus smile nostalgically. When they finally returned to the dock, all three were flushed with sun and salt air, reluctant to end this perfect interlude. "Again tomorrow?" Alaric asked Nereus as they secured the boat. The boy nodded eagerly, then surprised both adults by throwing his arms around his father's waist in a spontaneous hug. Alaric froze momentarily before enfolding his son in a fierce embrace, his eyes closing as if to capture this moment forever. Zarya discreetly moved away, giving them privacy for this breakthrough. She climbed the cliff steps alone, heart full with the day's simple joys and the healing she'd witnessed. At the top, her contentment shattered. Olympia stood on the garden terrace, watching her emergence with frigid disapproval. "Enjoying yourself, Ms. Kalua?" The question was pointed as a dagger. Very much, Zaria replied evenly. It was a beautiful day for sailing. Sailing, Olympia's eyebrows rose. On the sea spirit? Yes. Alaric thought it would be good for Nereus to— That was Seraphina's boat, Olympia cut in. Alaric hasn't taken it out since her death. Sometimes healing requires revisiting painful memories, Zaria said carefully, finding the joy within them again. Olympia stepped closer, her perfume expensive and overwhelming. Let me be perfectly clear, Ms. Kalua. You are not Seraphina. You will never be Seraphina. And this performance you're staging with her pendant and her boat and her family cannot continue. The accusation stung, but Zaria held her ground. I've never pretended to be Seraphina. I'm helping Nereus and Alaric find their way forward, not back. How noble, Olympia's tone dripped with sarcasm. And I suppose the fact that my son is one of the wealthiest men on the eastern seaboard has nothing to do with your dedication. My contract is for 6 months, Zaria replied, anger rising despite her efforts to remain professional. The salary is generous but standard for my qualifications. If you're implying I'm pursuing Alaric for financial gain, I'm not implying anything, dear. I'm stating it outright. Olympia's smile was venomous. A nurse from modest circumstances, conveniently appearing when my son and grandson are at their most vulnerable. The pendant was particularly audacious, I must say. That was Alaric's decision, not mine. Alaric isn't thinking clearly. Hasn't been since Seraphina died. He's mistaking gratitude for other feelings. She adjusted her designer watch with precision. Did you know Catherine Blackwood comes from one of Boston's oldest families? Their shipping line would complement Montclair perfectly. A merger would secure thousands of jobs. For years, our companies have been competitors. But imagine what we could accomplish together. The board has been pushing for this alliance since before Seraphina's illness. Nereus isn't a business asset, Zaria said, her voice low with barely contained fury. And neither is Alaric's heart. Such dramatics, Olympia sighed. Let me be practical then. The board of Montclair Shipping, of which I am a significant member, would look unfavorably on Alaric forming an attachment to someone so unsuitable. It could affect confidence in his leadership. Are you threatening his position because of me? Zaria asked incredulously. I'm merely stating facts. Nereus needs stability and connection to his proper social circle. Alaric needs a partner who understands his world. You, my dear, provide neither. Her gaze was steel. If you truly care about them, you'll recognize when your presence does more harm than good. Before Zaria could respond, Nereus and Alaric crested the cliff steps, their faces alight with the day's joy. Olympia's demeanor shifted instantly, a gracious smile replacing her predatory expression. There you are. I was just telling Ms. Kalua about the wonderful dinner Catherine prepared at the Blackwoods summer home. She's quite accomplished. Graduated top of her class at Harvard, you know. The abrupt transition left Zaria reeling, as Olympia skillfully monopolized the conversation with Alaric, drawing him toward the house with mentions of urgent business matters. Nereus remained beside Zaria, his perceptive eyes moving between her troubled face and his grandmother's retreating figure. He tugged Zaria's hand, his expression questioning. It's nothing, she assured him, forcing a smile. Just adult complications. But Olympia's threats echoed in her mind, shattering the peace of their perfect day and planting seeds of doubt that would grow into the night's darkest hours. Love, or whatever was blossoming between her and Alaric, shouldn't come at the cost of his son's security or his own livelihood. For the first time since arriving at Montclair Estate, Zaria wondered if leaving might be the kindest choice after all. Chapter 9. Truth in Whispers. Sleep eluded Zaria that night. Olympia's threats circled her mind like hungry predators, picking apart her confidence with sharp-toothed doubts. Was she truly helping Nereus and Alaric, or had she inserted herself into a fragile ecosystem, causing more disruption than healing? By dawn, she'd made a decision. She would speak to Alaric about Olympia's concerns, not as accusations, but as genuine questions to be considered. If her presence truly threatened his position or Nereus's well-being, she would step aside, regardless of what her heart whispered. As she dressed, a soft knock sounded at her door. Opening it, she found Nereus, already dressed, though the sun had barely risen. His worried expression sent her maternal instincts into high alert. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked, kneeling to his level. He thrust his sketchbook toward her. The page showed Olympia looming over a figure clearly meant to be Zaria, dark storm clouds gathering overhead. In the background, smaller figures of Alaric and Nereus watched helplessly. "You saw us talking yesterday," Zaria realized. "You're worried about what your grandmother said to me." Nereus nodded vigorously, his eyes pleading for reassurance. "Your grandmother wants what's best for you," she said carefully. "We just disagree about what that is." The boy shook his head frantically, turning to a new page in his sketchbook. This drawing showed Zaria packing a suitcase, Nereus and Alaric watching with tears. Her heart clenched. "You're afraid I'm going to leave." He nodded, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "Oh, Nereus." She embraced him gently. "I don't want to leave you. But sometimes adults have to make difficult choices, especially when they care about someone." He pulled back, frustration evident in his features. With sudden determination, he grasped her hand and pulled her toward the door. "Where are we going?" she asked as he led her through the silent house. Nereus pointed ahead, his pace quickening as they approached the music room. Inside, he guided her to the piano and patted the bench. When she sat, he positioned himself beside her, looking at her expectantly. "You want me to play?" she guessed. He shook his head, pointing at the keys, then at himself. Understanding dawned. "You want to play for me?" A decisive nod. A decisive nod. Zaria watched in astonishment as Nereus placed his small hands on the keys and began to play. The melody was simple but hauntingly beautiful, a lullaby she instantly recognized as the one she had sung during the storm, the one his mother had sung before her. Nereus played with the passionate intensity of someone desperate to communicate, his eyes closed in concentration. When the final notes faded, he looked up at her, his gaze direct and imploring. "That was beautiful," she whispered, deeply moved by this unexpected revelation. "I didn't know you played." He pointed to a framed photograph on the wall that she hadn't noticed before. Serafina at this same piano, a younger Nereus on her lap, their hands together on the keys. "Your mother taught you," Zaria understood. "And you haven't played since she died." He nodded, then pointed at Zaria, at himself, and finally at the door that led toward Alaric's wing of the house. "You're playing again because of us," she interpreted, "because things are changing." Another nod, more emphatic. He flipped to a blank page in his sketchbook and wrote in careful letters, "Don't go." The simple plea pierced her heart. "Nereus, it's complicated." He shook his head stubbornly and wrote again, "We need you." Footsteps in the hallway interrupted them. They looked up to find Alaric in the doorway, disheveled from sleep, wonder spreading across his features as he registered the scene before him. Were you playing?" he asked his son, voice rough with emotion. Nereus nodded shyly. "It was the lullaby," Zaria explained. "The one from the storm." Alaric moved slowly into the room, as if afraid a sudden movement might shatter this miracle. "Serafina would be so proud," he said, kneeling before his son. "So am I." Nereus threw his arms around his father's neck, clinging tightly. Over the boy's shoulder, Alaric's eyes met Zaria's, filled with gratitude and something deeper that made her breath catch. "Why don't you keep practicing while I talk to Zaria in the garden?" Alaric suggested gently. "Just for a few minutes." Nereus hesitated, glancing between them with concern. "It's okay," Zaria reassured him. "I promise we'll come right back." Reluctantly, the boy returned to the piano, beginning the lullaby again as Alaric led Zaria outside. The morning air was crisp with salt and possibility, the first golden light touching the cliffs beyond the garden. "You look troubled," Alaric observed as they walked along the stone path. "Is it my mother?" "Partly," Zaria admitted. "She made some pointed observations yesterday. Let me guess, you're unsuitable, opportunistic, and threatening the Montclair legacy." His tone was resigned rather than surprised. "Something like that," she confirmed. "She also implied your position at the company could be jeopardized if you continued to care about you," he finished when she hesitated. "Yes." Alaric stopped, turning to face her fully. "My mother is a master manipulator. She's leveraged the company against my personal choices for years. But this time she's miscalculated." "How so?" "Because this time I've found something worth fighting for." His hand rose to touch the pendant at her throat. "Serafina made me promise to live, not just exist. For 3 years I've been sleepwalking. Then you arrived with your fierce compassion and unflinching honesty, and suddenly I was awake again." Zaria's heart thundered in her chest. "Alaric, let me finish," he said gently. "I've spent my life calculating risks, weighing outcomes. But what's happening between us, what's happening in this house, isn't a business decision. It's about choosing life over fear, joy over security." "Your mother said Catherine Blackwood." "Catherine is part of a world I've outgrown," he interrupted. "A world of strategic alliances and bloodless mergers. Serafina showed me there was more, and now, somehow, you've reminded me." He took both her hands in his. "I don't know what the future holds, Zaria, but I know I don't want to face it without you beside us." "What about Nereus?" she whispered, her last defense crumbling. "Nereus just played the piano for the first time in 3 years." "Because of you." Alaric's voice caught. "You've given my son his spirit back. You've given me mine." With tender deliberation, he cupped her face in his hands. "I'm falling in love with you, Zaria. I think I have been since that first storm, when you sang my son back from the darkness." The confession hung in the morning air between them, honest and vulnerable. Zaria felt tears gathering in her eyes, her heart expanding with a joy so intense it bordered on pain. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered. "But I'm afraid, Alaric. Afraid of hurting Nereus if this doesn't work. Afraid of causing more upheaval in lives that have already seen too much loss." "Some risks are worth taking," he said softly, his thumbs gently brushing her cheeks. "This is one of them." In the golden light of dawn, with the sea breeze caressing their skin, Alaric lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. When Zaria responded, sliding her arms around his neck, the kiss deepened into something profound and transformative, a promise, a beginning, a homecoming. When they finally parted, breathless and slightly dazed, Alaric rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know what my mother will do," he admitted. "She can make things difficult at the company. But I won't let her come between us, or between me and Nereus's well-being." "Are you sure?" Zaria asked, needing his absolute certainty. "More sure than I've been of anything in 3 years." His smile was radiant with newfound strength. "Serafina would approve, you know. She always said the heart knows its own truth, if only we listen to its whispers." Hand in hand, they returned to the music room, where Nereus still played, his face alight with concentration. When he saw them enter together, their entwined fingers telling their own story, hope bloomed across his features. "Nereus," Alaric said gently, "Zaria and I have something to tell you." The boy's eyes darted between them, landing on their clasped hands with growing understanding. "We care about each other," Zaria explained, "in a special way. But that doesn't mean we're forgetting your mother or trying to replace her. No one could ever do that." Nereus considered this solemnly, then reached for his sketchbook. With deliberate strokes, he drew 4 figures, himself, Alaric, Zaria, and above them Seraphina as an angel, smiling down. Beneath it, he wrote one word: family. As Alaric embraced his son, Zaria felt something miraculous taking shape around them. Not a replacement for what was lost, but something new and precious built upon the foundation of love and memory. A whispered truth, too powerful to deny, too beautiful to fear. Chapter 10. Worlds apart. The tranquility of their morning revelation shattered at breakfast. Olympia swept into the dining room with storm clouds in her eyes, Catherine Blackwood following in her wake like an elegantly tailored shadow. "I've invited Catherine to join us," Olympia announced, ignoring the startled expressions around the table. "She's been so concerned about Nereus's progress. After our conversation yesterday about her methods, I thought a professional demonstration would be helpful." Catherine, tall, blonde, and perfectly composed in a designer suit, smiled with practiced warmth. "I hope you don't mind the early intrusion, Alaric. When Olympia mentioned Nereus might be experiencing a breakthrough, I was naturally eager to offer my professional assessment." Alaric stood slowly, the CEO displacing the lover of moments ago. "While I appreciate your interest, Catherine, this isn't a convenient time for an evaluation." "Oh, it's nothing so formal," Catherine assured him, sliding into a chair beside Nereus, who instantly stiffened. "Just a friendly observation. After all, we've known each other since we were children. Isn't that right, Nereus?" The boy stared fixedly at his plate, shoulders hunched protectively. "Perhaps another time," Zaria suggested, instinctively moving to shield Nereus from Catherine's intense scrutiny. Catherine's smile never wavered, though her eyes hardened slightly. "You must be the nurse Olympia mentioned. How fortunate for Alaric to find such dedicated help in this remote location." The dismissal in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. Before Zaria could respond, Olympia smoothly interjected. "Catherine just returned from a conference in Switzerland on childhood trauma. The research on selective mutism is making remarkable progress. Apparently, the latest protocols recommend structured reintegration therapy, boarding facilities with specialized programs." "Nereus is doing well with his current approach," Alaric countered, tension evident in his jaw. "This morning he played the piano," Catherine finished, nodding as if this confirmed her theories. Olympia mentioned it. A significant step, certainly, but still a nonverbal expression. The concern is whether he's becoming too comfortable in his silence. Zaria felt her professional composure slipping. "With respect, Doctor, Blackwood, comfort, and safety are precisely what allow trauma recovery to progress naturally. Forced verbalization—" "Science supports structured intervention," Catherine interrupted smoothly. "My approach has shown a 70% success rate with similar cases." "Nereus isn't a case," Alaric said, echoing his words from days before. "And he isn't going to boarding school." Catherine leaned forward, her expression softening to practiced compassion. "No one's suggesting immediate enrollment, Alaric, but perhaps allowing me some one-on-one time with Nereus, just to establish a baseline assessment." Before Alaric could reply, his phone buzzed with an urgent message. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "Excuse me," he said tersely. "Business emergency. As he stepped into the hallway to take the call, an awkward silence fell over the table. Nereus looked increasingly distressed, shooting pleading glances at Zarya. "Perhaps I could show you Nereus's artwork," Zarya suggested to Catherine, attempting to steer towards safer ground. "His visual communication is quite sophisticated." "How charming," Catherine replied with the faintest condescension. "But I'm more interested in his verbal potential. Nereus, can you tell me about your morning? Just one word would be wonderful progress." The boy's face drained of color, his breathing quickening toward panic. "That's enough," Zarya said firmly, standing. "Nereus, why don't you go to the sunroom? I'll join you in a moment." With visible relief, he slipped from his chair and hurried from the room. "That was highly unprofessional," Zarya told Catherine once Nereus was out of earshot. "Pressuring a traumatized child for speech can trigger regression." Catherine's pleasant facade remained intact, though her eyes turned glacial. "What's unprofessional is a nurse overstepping her boundaries into psychological territory. Olympia has explained your special interest in this household, Miss Kalua." "My only interest is Nereus's well-being," Zarya replied evenly. "Is it?" Olympia interjected, her voice silky with implication. "The Montclair name carries significant advantages: social position, financial security, tempting incentives for someone from your background." Before Zarya could respond to this blatant insult, Alaric returned, his expression grim. "What's wrong?" Zarya asked immediately, recognizing the tension in his shoulders. "Dominic Blackwood has just made a hostile move for our Singapore shipping routes," he said flatly. "The board is meeting in emergency session. I have to leave for Boston immediately." Understanding dawned in Zarya's eyes. "This isn't a coincidence." "What are you implying?" Catherine asked, her tone suddenly sharp. "That this emergency conveniently removes Alaric while you attempt to evaluate Nereus against his father's wishes," Zarya stated bluntly. Olympia's laugh was cold. "How dramatic. Business emergencies happen regardless of personal matters, though I must say Catherine's father has impeccable timing." Alaric's expression hardened as he looked between his mother and Catherine. "I need to speak with Zarya. Alone." In the hallway, he pulled her into his study, closing the door firmly. "I have to go," he said, conflict evident in his eyes. "If Blackwood secures those routes, 100 of our employees could lose their jobs." "I understand," Zarya assured him, "but I'm worried about what will happen here while you're gone." "So am I." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "But I trust you with Nereus. Don't let them pressure him, regardless of their credentials or connections." "And us?" she asked quietly. "After this morning." "Nothing has changed," he said firmly, taking her hands in his. "My mother and the Blackwoods will attempt to undermine you, us, in every way possible. But I meant what I said, Zarya. I choose you. I choose the path we're creating together." His kiss was swift but fierce, a promise in the midst of chaos. "I'll be back as soon as I can. 2 days at most." After Alaric's departure, the atmosphere at Montclair Estate turned arctic. Olympia installed Catherine in the guest wing for convenience and proceeded to orchestrate a subtle but relentless campaign against Zarya's position. First came the questions about her qualifications, disguised as casual conversation but designed to highlight her supposed inadequacies. Then came the reminiscences of Serafina, pointed reminders of a woman Zarya could never replace. Finally, in the evening, Catherine attempted to separate Zarya from Nereus, suggesting professional assessment time that Zarya firmly refused. "You're making this more difficult than necessary," Olympia remarked coldly when they found themselves alone in the library. "Catherine and Alaric have history, a shared background, common interests. The Blackwood-Montclair merger would secure the company's future. Alaric isn't a commodity to be traded, Zarya replied. Neither is Nereus. Everyone has a price, Olympia said, her gaze calculating. Name yours. Zarya stared at her in disbelief. Excuse me? A generous settlement, enough to establish your own pediatric practice, perhaps, in exchange for a graceful departure? The insult was breathtaking in its audacity. You really think I can be bought? Everyone can, Olympia replied with cool certainty. It's simply a matter of finding the right currency. That night, as Zarya tucked Nereus into bed, her mind whirled with conflict. The boy sensed her distress, his questioning eyes searching her face. Everything will be fine, she assured him, despite her own doubts. Your father will be home soon. But as she returned to her room, a text message shattered her fragile confidence. Board meeting extended. Blackwood situation worse than anticipated. Back in 4 days. Don't let them push you away. Worlds apart indeed, Zarya thought as she stared out at the dark sea. Alaric fighting corporate battles in Boston, while she defended their newfound happiness against enemies within his own home. For the first time, the vastness of the differences between them, not just race or background, but entire universes of experience and expectation, seemed truly insurmountable. Chapter 11. The Sacrifice. By the 3rd day of Alaric's absence, Montclair Estate had transformed into an exquisitely polite battlefield. Catherine and Olympia executed their strategy with surgical precision, isolating Zarya, undermining her authority with the staff, and speaking about her future in the past tense. The children at your grandmother's neighborhood must miss your care, Catherine remarked over dinner. Will you return to community work after your time here? My commitment is to Nereus, Zarya replied evenly, for as long as he needs me. Children are remarkably resilient, Olympia observed. They adapt to new caregivers quickly with the right approach. Nereus, witness to these exchanges, grew increasingly withdrawn. The piano remained untouched, his sketchbook abandoned. Even their morning walks along the cliff path failed to spark his usual curiosity. He was retreating back into his protective shell, his progress eroding under the constant tension. That night, Zarya found him awake long past bedtime, staring out his window at the lighthouse beam sweeping across the darkened sea. Can't sleep? She asked softly, sitting beside him on the window seat. He shook his head, then reached for his sketchbook, opening to a drawing he'd made earlier. The Montclair mansion divided in half, dark storm clouds above one side where Catherine and Olympia stood, sunshine breaking through above the other where Zarya, Alaric, and Nereus stood together. I know it feels that way, Zarya acknowledged, like the house is divided between different futures. Nereus nodded solemnly, then flipped to a new page where he'd sketched something that made Zarya's heart ache. Alaric, standing alone at a crossroads, pulled in opposite directions by invisible forces. You're worried about your father having to choose, she interpreted, between what his mother wants and what might make him happy. Another nod, more emphatic. Your father is stronger than you realize, Zarya assured him, though her own doubts lingered. He knows what matters most. Nereus considered this, then wrote carefully beneath his drawing. People will lose jobs. The insight startled her. Of course, Nereus would have overheard the adults' discussions, would understand the business implications of Alaric defying Olympia and rejecting the Blackwood alliance. That's a very grown-up worry, she said gently. But it's not your responsibility, or even your father's, to sacrifice happiness for business. But even as she spoke the reassurance, Zarya questioned its truth. Lives and livelihoods did hang in the balance of Alaric's choices. The Montclair-Blackwood merger would secure jobs, expand operations, create stability for countless families. Against such significant benefits, what weight did her own heart carry? Her presence had helped Nereus begin to heal, true, but perhaps he needed more than what she alone could provide. Catherine's methods, while different from Zaria's intuitive approach, could offer structured techniques that might complement what they'd started. The woman was qualified and connected to resources Zaria couldn't access. Perhaps the answer wasn't either-or, but finding a middle path that put Nereus first. And Alaric, what future could she truly offer him? A man accustomed to moving in the highest social and business circles, whose family legacy stretched back generations, whose every decision affected thousands. Their worlds had briefly, magically overlapped in this coastal interlude, but reality waited beyond the estate's gates. Nereus tugged her sleeve, breaking her reverie. His perceptive eyes studied her face, clearly reading the doubts she couldn't hide. "Time for sleep," she said, mustering a smile. "Things often look clearer in the morning light." But clarity, when it came with dawn, brought no comfort. Her morning run along the cliff path led her to the lighthouse, where she stopped to catch her breath and gather her thoughts. The structure stood resolute against the elements, its purpose singular and unwavering, to guide ships safely through dangerous waters. What was her purpose here, truly? Had she been guiding this family toward healing, or had she unwittingly steered them toward rocks of her own creation? The conflict between Alaric and his mother, the business turmoil, Nereus's renewed withdrawal, how much stemmed from her presence? Her phone buzzed with a text from Alaric. "Board still deadlocked. Blackwood pushing advantage. Miss you both terribly. Hold on. A." Tears pricked her eyes as she typed her response. "We miss you too. Nereus struggling with tension here. Take care of business. We'll be fine." She pocketed her phone, decision crystallizing like salt from evaporating seawater. Sometimes love meant staying and fighting. Other times, the harder times, it meant stepping aside to clear the path for those you cared about. Back at the estate, she found Mrs. Fletcher in the kitchen, supervising breakfast preparations. "I need to make arrangements to return to town for a few days," Zaria said, keeping her voice steady. "My grandmother requires a checkup. Would you ensure Nereus maintains his routine while I'm away?" The housekeeper's shrewd eyes assessed her. "Ms. Drayton Montclair will be pleased," she observed neutrally. "This isn't about Olympia," Zaria replied, though they both knew otherwise. "It's about what's best for everyone." "Is it?" Mrs. Fletcher's tone softened unexpectedly. "Miss Serafina faced similar pressures, you know. The Montclair family wasn't initially enthusiastic about an artist with bohemian tendencies. She stood her ground, said true happiness was worth any price. The parallel wasn't lost on Zaria, but neither was the crucial difference. Serafina wasn't potentially costing people their livelihoods. "Perhaps not," the housekeeper conceded, but she understood something important about this family. They need outsiders to remind them how to live, not just how to maintain appearances and balance ledgers. Before Zaria could respond, Olympia appeared in the doorway. "Ah, Ms. Kalua." Catherine was hoping to observe Nereus's morning routine for her assessment. "I'm afraid I'll have to decline," Zaria said firmly. "Nereus's schedule shouldn't be disrupted further." "It won't be disrupted for much longer," Olympia remarked with thinly veiled satisfaction. "Alaric just called. He's approved Catherine's preliminary evaluation plan. She'll begin formal sessions with Nereus tomorrow." The news landed like a physical blow. "He wouldn't make that decision without consulting me." "Business realities sometimes necessitate personal compromises," Olympia said smoothly. "The Blackwood merger is proceeding, with Catherine's involvement with Nereus as a goodwill gesture." Though suspecting manipulation, Zarya felt doubt creep in. 4 days of intense board pressure, the responsibilities of hundreds of employees weighing on his decisions. Would Alaric compromise to save the company? That afternoon, while helping Nereus with his science project, Zarya's phone rang with a call from her grandmother. The timing seemed like a sign from the universe, confirmation of the path forward. "I'm coming home for a few days," she told her grandmother after they'd exchanged greetings. "There are some things I need to sort out." After ending the call, she looked up to find Nereus watching her with knowing eyes. He didn't seem surprised, only resigned, as if he'd been expecting this moment. "It's just temporary," she assured him, the lie bitter on her tongue. "A few days to check on Grandma." He didn't believe her. She could see it in the slump of his shoulders, the resigned acceptance in his eyes as he turned away and began packing up his project materials. That night, after he'd fallen asleep, Zarya packed a small bag and wrote 2 letters. One for Nereus, explaining that sometimes love meant making difficult choices, and one for Alaric, releasing him to the future his family needed, assuring him she would always carry their brief happiness in her heart. As she slipped from the house in pre-dawn darkness, the sacrifice felt both excruciating and right, a clean break that would allow healing for everyone. She didn't look back as the taxi carried her away from Montclair Estate, though tears streamed unchecked down her face, carrying with them dreams of what might have been. Chapter 12. Whispers of Forever. 3 days after leaving Montclair Estate, Zarya sat on her grandmother's porch swing, watching autumn leaves dance across the modest garden. The small cottage felt both comforting in its familiarity and strangely confining after the expansive mansion by the sea. "You're not telling me everything," her grandmother observed, settling beside her with 2 steaming mugs of tea. "This isn't just about checking on my health." Zarya accepted the tea gratefully. "It's complicated, Grandma." "Love usually is," the older woman replied with the quiet wisdom of experience. "Especially when it involves crossing worlds. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who raised you." Her grandmother's eyes were kind but penetrating. "The Montclair boy. The silent one. You've helped him." "He played the piano," Zarya said softly, the memory both sweet and painful. "He was starting to heal. They both were. And the father." Zarya's silence was answer enough. "Ah." Her grandmother nodded. "So you left because—" "Because sometimes love means making hard choices," Zarya echoed the words from her letter. "His family has expectations. The business needs stability. My presence was causing complications." "Sounds like excuses to me," her grandmother said bluntly. "Fear masquerading as nobility." "It's not that simple. It never is. But love isn't about simplicity, child. It's about courage." She patted Zarya's hand. "Your parents crossed worlds to be together. The academic and the nurse. Different backgrounds, different dreams. People said it wouldn't last. They were happy until the day they died." Tears stung Zarya's eyes. "This is different. Is it? Or are you just afraid of fighting for what matters?" Before Zarya could respond, her phone rang, Alaric's number flashing on the screen. She had ignored his previous calls, needing distance to maintain her resolve, but something compelled her to answer this time. "Zarya." His voice was rough with emotion and exhaustion. "Thank God. I've been trying to reach you for days." "I'm sorry," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I needed some time." "Nereus is sick," Alaric said without preamble. "He collapsed the day after you left. High fever, respiratory distress. The doctors say it's pneumonia, but he's not responding to treatment." Fear gripped her heart. "How serious?" "Serious enough that I've cancelled everything to be with him." Alaric's voice cracked. "He refuses to eat, barely sleeps. The doctors say his physical symptoms are exacerbated by emotional distress. Where are you now? Clearwater Cove Regional Hospital. He's been here for 5 days now. The initial crisis has passed, but he paused, gathering himself. Zarya, he needs you. We both do. The doctors say his emotional state is preventing full recovery. What about your mother? The Blackwoods. The merger. To hell with all of it, Alaric said with sudden, fierce clarity. I almost lost Serafina without telling her what mattered most. I won't make that mistake again. Her grandmother, who had discreetly moved inside during the call, reappeared with car keys in hand. Clearwater Cove is an hour away, she said simply. You'd better get moving. The hospital corridor seemed endless as Zarya hurried toward Nereus's room, her heart pounding with fear and hope. She found Alaric outside the door, his tall frame bent with exhaustion, dark shadows beneath his eyes. Zarya, he breathed, straightening at her approach. You came. Of course I came, she said, fighting the urge to throw herself into his arms. How is he? Resting more comfortably now. The worst of the pneumonia has responded to treatment, but his recovery has been slower than expected. Relief and lingering fear mingled in his voice. The doctors say his physical symptoms are improving, but his emotional withdrawal is concerning. He's been in and out of consciousness for days. She nodded, hesitating at the threshold. And everything else? Everything else can wait, Alaric said firmly. Right now, all that matters is in that room. They entered quietly, finding Nereus pale against the white hospital sheets, an IV in his small arm, oxygen tubing beneath his nose. Despite the improvement Alaric had mentioned, he looked fragile, diminished. Zarya moved to his bedside, gently taking his hand. His eyes fluttered open at her touch, disbelief and joy washing across his features when he registered her presence. Hello, sweetheart, she whispered, tears falling freely now. I'm so sorry I left. Nereus clutched her hand weakly, his eyes communicating everything his voice could not. I made a mistake, she continued softly. I thought I was doing what was best for everyone, but I was really just afraid. Afraid of not belonging in your world, of causing more problems than I solved. That was never true, Alaric said, moving to stand beside her. You belong with us, Zarya. You always have from that first night when you sang away the storm. Nereus tugged at their joined hands, then pointed to the bedside table where his ever-present sketchbook lay. Alaric handed it to him, and with trembling fingers, the boy opened to a drawing he must have created before falling ill. A lighthouse standing strong against crashing waves, its powerful beam cutting through darkness. You, Alaric translated, his voice thick with emotion. You're our lighthouse, Zarya, guiding us safely home. She looked between father and son, these two souls who had somehow become essential to her own. I was wrong to leave, she admitted. Whatever challenges we face, we should face them together. Together, Alaric agreed. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing something that gleamed in the soft hospital light. I've been carrying this since the day after you left, waiting for the right moment. In his palm lay a ring, a stunning sapphire surrounded by diamonds, its blue depths reminiscent of the sea they all loved. This was my grandmother's, he explained, then my mother's, though she rarely wore it, preferring more ostentatious pieces. I always thought it looked like the ocean at dawn, the moment when night surrenders to possibility. Zarya's breath caught as understanding dawned. Alaric, I'm not asking right now, he clarified quickly. Not here, not like this. But I want you to know that when I do ask, and I will, it won't be impulsive or reactive. It will be because I've thought about every possible future and found you in all of them. From the hospital bed came a sound that froze them both in astonishment, a small, raspy voice whispering a single, perfect word. Yes. Nereus, wide-eyed at his own accomplishment, looked as shocked as they were. Then he smiled, a full, radiant smile that transformed his face, and repeated more confidently, "Yes." "Nereus," Alaric breathed, joy and disbelief warring in his expression. "You spoke." The boy nodded, then looked at Zaria expectantly, waiting for her response to his father's not-quite proposal. "Well," she said, laughing through her tears, "if Nereus approves—" Alaric's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, a pledge of all they would build together. When they parted, he kept his arms around her, creating a circle that included his son. "What about your mother?" Zaria asked, reality intruding on the perfect moment. "The business?" "My mother has returned to Boston where she belongs," Alaric said firmly. "As for the business, I've restructured the board. The Blackwood merger is off the table. We'll find another way forward. And if people lose jobs—" "They won't," he assured her. "I've been too cautious, too willing to maintain the status quo. There are other alliances, other opportunities that don't require sacrificing what matters most." Nereus tugged at their sleeves, drawing their attention back to him. With careful deliberation, he formed 3 words, each one a miracle. "We are family." In that hospital room, with monitors beeping quietly and autumn sunlight streaming through the windows, Zaria recognized the truth in his simple declaration. Family wasn't defined by blood or background, by corporate alliances or social expectations. It was created in moments of courage and sacrifice, built through storms and calm seas alike, sustained by love that refused to surrender to fear. As Nereus drifted back to healing sleep, his hand still holding hers, Zaria felt the last of her doubts dissolve. The future remained unwritten, but they would navigate it together, guided by the whispers of their hearts, whispers of healing, of hope, of forever.